Hey class, in this video I want to talk about wall covering and repair. By the end of the lesson you'll be able to identify what are some materials that cover walls and how you can repair drywall. Think about your own home. What are some materials that cover the walls where you live? After you've framed your wall and installed the wiring and electrical and plumbing, you now have to cover the walls. And we cover the walls in something called drywall or sheetrock. And those are just two names to describe gypsum wallboard. What is it? Well, basically, it's two pieces of paper, and in the middle is what's called gypsum. And gypsum's like a rock, kind of looks like chalk, all right? And that's what makes up drywall. It's sold in 4x8 sheets. They're also sold in pairs. You can also get them in different thicknesses, and they're used to cover walls. And we're going to talk about how that's used in a little bit. I grew up in Old Weathersfield, and the house that I lived in was built before World War II. Houses built before World War II had plaster for walls. The way plaster walls were made is they would put up wooden strips called lath over the framed lumber. All right? The lath was made with little openings in between the wooden lath pieces. That opening would allow plaster, wet plaster when it's applied, to go ahead and actually key in to the laths and kind of hook in there and lock in place. Now they would have to put layer after layer after layer of plaster on the walls, but eventually you'd have a nice smooth wall. This process was pretty expensive and took a long time. After World War II, when all the soldiers came home, there was a huge housing boom. And so to improve and speed up the process of building homes, they invented gypsum wallboard. Hopefully you can see by comparing the plaster here and the gypsum wallboard on the previous slide what the differences are and how using drywall would be a lot easier to do. Some people have gotten paid a lot of money to fix plaster walls, while some residents have decided to remove plaster walls altogether and replace the walls with drywall. The problem with gypsum wallboard and plaster is they don't hold up well to water. So if you're going to hang up a wall inside a bathroom, especially inside a shower or a tub area, you want to make sure that you install some type of wallboard that it can resist water. And so to do that, we have now invented what's called cement board. And cement board is basically just a thin layer of cement with some reinforced edges and some fiberglass mesh. So if you're making a new bathtub surround or a new shower surround, you're going to surround that area with what's called cement board. It makes a good base for tile and marble. It's resistant to water and mold, and it's ideal and required if you're installing new bathrooms and kitchens where water is going to be nearby. Another way to improve the look of drywall is to add what's called wainscoting, where basically you install wooden strips or molding or other types of pieces to make the wall look a lot decorative. And sometimes it's done on the lower portion of the wall, and usually it differentiates in color as well. But it's pretty decorative. It makes the house look a little bit more fancy, and that's what's called wainscoting or paneling. Another type of paneling that's used, which I have seen, is you can actually go to Home Depot and actually buy a brick textured panel, 4x8 sheet of brick textured panel. You can also see people that have done rough sawn lumber to texture their walls. My back porch in my home is covered in old pallets to give it that rough sawn lumber look. And then also a lot of times, and you might visit a house built in the 60s, you might see a lot of this wood paneling. And so wood paneling was a very popular way to cover walls. So those are some other alternatives besides using plaster and sheetrock to cover walls. What are some other things you've seen to cover walls? Painting walls is pretty popular, along with wallpaper as well. The next thing we're going to discuss is how to install drywall. So you go ahead, go to Home Depot, get yourself a couple sheets of 4x8 drywall. Make sure it's the right thickness that you need. And then once you have it measured, you have to go ahead and cut it to the right width. To cut drywall, go ahead and cut the back of the drywall with a nice sharp utility knife. Once you have it cut all the way through, give the drywall a quick snap, and it'll actually snap right across the mark that you've made with utility knife. You don't actually have to cut all the way through the drywall, you just have to score it. Then you want to go ahead and cut the front side of the drywall. Again, it's important to use a sharp utility knife when you do it. Another thing that can help you is a large T-square or level so you can make yourself a nice straight line. Once the drywall is cut, we now have to screw it to the wall. Now you're going to use what are called drywall screws. And if you remember, we talked about the difference between drywall screws and decking screws. Drywall screws are just made to hold drywall to the wall. Something that you can use to help you out is an actual screw setter like you see here, which actually allows the screw to actually dimple in a little bit into the drywall. And if you're going to do this as a career, you can actually buy yourself a drywall drill specifically for that job. Once the drywall is hung, now we need some more tools to cover up the screw holes that we've made. All right, so you're going to get yourself either some mesh tape or mesh paper. You're going to get yourself some joint compound, and you want to get yourself a nice sturdy putty knife. And these are the basic tools that you would use if you're installing drywall. If you're repairing drywall, we'll take a look at that in a little bit. So while we said that installing drywall is a little bit different than installing plaster, there are a number of steps that you need to take to make sure that your drywall has a nice finished texture. So you're going to take your joint compound, and with your joint compound and your putty knife, you're going to first cover over any of the screw holes that you might see on your drywall. That's your first step. Next step is you want to take a sizable amount of joint compound and you want to put it where you have two pieces of drywall that come together. With your nice thick mud, you're going to go ahead and lay in some either paper tape or some mesh tape into that mud and then cover it with another wider coating of joint compound. Once that is dry, you're going to get yourself a larger putty knife and you're going to go ahead and cover the drywall with a second coat of joint compound, and then your third and last coat is now a wider coat of joint compound. Now you might say, why do I need so many steps? Well, the idea is by using more steps and having the drywall go out further and further and further and further and wider and wider and wider, you are faking your eyes so you don't actually see where the drywall actually is, where the joint compound actually is. So you shouldn't see any seams. When you paint it, it will cover this up. But again, you want to do a good job so it's nice and smooth and you run your hand over it and you can't feel any type of difference in texture. This is really, really important, especially if you're going to paint the walls. This entire process might take a couple days. Now, as you go to drywall, you might see that they sell mesh or paper, and you might wonder, well, which one is better than the other? And really, it depends on who you work with. The paper is nice because you can actually fold the paper in half when you're working in seams. The mesh is nice because sometimes it actually has an adhesive on it. So really, it's the pick of the contractor or person that you're working with. But these are essential when you're covering up seams and you're covering up joints because you want to reduce the ability of that drywall to flex and create cracks. You might see some cracks in your ceiling and your wall. Those should be repaired using either paper or mesh. Now, as you walk through the home centers, you'll see containers that say joint compound and you'll see containers that say spackle. Well, what's the difference? There is a big difference. Pick up one jar and kind of feel the difference. You'll actually feel that the joint compound is actually a lot heavier than the spackle. Why is that? Well, joint compound is used specifically for taping the joints in drywall. It's what is used when drywall is installed. You are using joint compound. Sometimes they'll actually mix it up with water to make it a little bit thinner. They put it on with several thin light coats and it takes a longer time to dry. Now, spackle is used primarily for filling small cracks and small holes. It's lighter because some spackle is made to be put on without having to sand. It dries very, very fast. Some of it you can even buy pink, and then when it's dry, it turns white. And there's actually less of a shrink when you're using spackle. Joint compound, you have to make sure that you sand it to get it nice and smooth. Again, it takes a longer time to dry because joint compound is used when you're installing the wall. Spackle is used when you're fixing the wall. However, if you do a big enough hole, you're going to need some joint compound to fix up that hole. Also, spackle is usually found in the paint aisle, whereas joint compound is usually found with the other joint compound and drywall tools. Now, here is some real life examples from my house. The top picture is where I had to move an outlet in my bathroom. This is the outlet that I had for my vanity light. I had to move the outlets over about 8 inches. So I had to cut a hole and install a new electrical box. And then I took a little piece of drywall and put it inside where the old box was. And I had to patch that up. And I wanted to make sure that I did a good job. Now, one of the things you want to make sure that when you go ahead and paint drywall is you want to make sure that you use a good primer. All right. One of the things I did not do when I did my bathroom remodel is I forgot to prime the walls. And by forgetting to prime the walls, I actually ended up having what looked like pimples on my wall. And so I had to scrape all this paint off, sand it down, and then put up some primer. And that was an important step when you're done with your joint compound or your drywall, is to make sure you put up a primer coat before you paint. So what are some other things we can do to repair drywall? Let's take a look. So if you're going to paint, like I said, you want to make sure that you use primer when you paint the walls after you put up joint compound or spackle. Now, if you're going to paint the walls, you want to make sure that your walls have a nice, smooth finish. If they don't, any small imperfection in the wall will stand out, especially if you use a glossy paint. Another question you have to ask yourself is, how big is the problem? Take a look at this picture here. Where does it look like that hole is? Well, that hole is actually from a ceiling. That's actually a ceiling light. All right. And you can see that somebody actually fell through the ceiling, all right, of this house. Now, clearly using some spackle is not going to be able to fix this problem. So you also have to kind of decide for your drywall repair, how big is this problem? Is it a crack or is it a hole? And then how big is the hole? So we're going to talk about a couple ways to fix some of these drywall issues. So if you have a small crack or a small hole, go to your home center or your local hardware store and pick yourself up a small jar of spackle. Doesn't cost too much. You can put it in with a little putty knife. You'll be good to go. Now, in college, we didn't have spackle. We actually used white toothpaste. It actually looked really, really nice when we were done. Hardly even noticed there was a crack there. If there's a large crack or a long crack, you might need to do some work. So it depends on the crack. The crack might actually come back. It depends on whether or not your house is settling. But if it's a small hole, spackle or toothpaste is the way to go. Now, putting in spackle is a little bit different than putting in joint compound. A good way to think of it is like frosting a cake or frosting a cupcake. Put a little bit on your putty knife, mush it into the hole, let it dry. Once it's dry, repeat over and over and over again until your hole is nice and covered. And if you have some sandpaper, you can sand it smooth. It'll look really, really nice, and just paint right over it. Now, if you have a large hole, there's a couple things you can do. One, you could take some newspaper and stuff it in the hole to kind of give it some support when you put in the spackle or the joint compound. You can buy yourself a little repair kit. Here's a little repair kit you can buy. It comes with a putty knife. It comes with some joint compound or some spackle, and then a little screen. What is the screen? Well, if you have a little hole, all right, on your wall, you can actually buy a metal backer that goes over the hole, and then a little sticker of joint compound tape, that little screen tape that I showed you, that actually goes over the metal backer. And then you put your spackle right over it, and it will dry and look really, really nice. And that metal backer actually reinforces the hole, which kind of, you can buy those in different sizes. Another thing that you could use is a small piece of sheetrock. They sell different sizes pieces of sheetrock. You could buy a 2-foot by 2-foot piece of sheetrock depending on the size hole that you have. Remember I showed you that picture of where somebody fell through the ceiling? Yeah, you're going to need a piece of sheetrock to cover up that size hole. How about the picture I showed you about the outlet that I moved? There again was another time where I would use a piece of sheetrock to cover the hole. So if you've got your sizable hole, all right, how can you support the sheetrock? Well, what you do is you use what's called a furring strip. All right, a furring strip is a piece of wood. You actually put that into the wall, screw it in place, and then take the right size piece of drywall and actually screw it to that furring strip. And then go ahead and use joint compound or spackle to cover the gap, making sure that you use some mesh or tape. it'll come out nice. I've actually done that in my grandmother's house when she had some curtain rods. I've done that in my house in the bathroom, which I showed you in a previous slide. It's a nice thing, a nice way to kind of fix that problem. They've actually made these little clips that you can use. One side clips to the good part of the sheetrock, one will clip to the new piece of sheetrock, and then you just bend away the little tabs. If you're going to use a big job, remember, use some joint compound. If you're going to use a small job, spackle is fine. There's a bunch of other ways to fix drywall. We'll take a look at those in a later video. So here's an instance where they had to move the outlet over probably about 12 inches to another spot on the wall for whatever reason. A couple ways that they fixed this drywall repair, as you can see, they probably used that furring strip that I talked about. There's probably a piece of wood in there. All right, they used some drywall screws and they screwed it there, and then they screwed in the new piece of drywall here. They have now covered it with that mesh tape, and now this part here is ready to be covered in joint compound. Down here, you can see they were able to cut a nicer hole. All right, probably use the utility knife and cut it nice and square, which they could have done up top. Put in 2 screws, probably into the stud, and now they just have to put some mesh over that, cover it with some joint compound, and they're good to go. So in this video, I just wanted to cover some different materials that are used to cover walls. What were some of the materials that we covered? We also talked about how you can repair drywall. And drywall is a thing that is often needed to repair, especially in college. That's a story for another day. Well, hopefully you enjoyed the video, and we'll talk to you soon.